To be back. I didn't have a fight in a bar, actually. I just had an encounter with a surgeon earlier in the week. You know, these things. Part of aging, actually. So, today I have a little more ambitious agenda in terms of covering things. So I'd like to ask if you would, unless it's a clarification or I'm saying something strange that you don't understand, let me move through the material and then we'll stop and talk afterward. So today we're going to try to probe the American sensibility in greater depth. I may not touch on things that you have fears about or that you yearn for, so I'll expect you to fill in the discussion. You remember this quote: one of the things we fear, I think, is having a life that's lived according to, as best we can, our own values, but then having something happen near the end of life that doesn't reflect us, that diminishes us, that leaves a memory of us, right? That we think is unworthy of us or is really negative in relation to the rest of our life. And I was talking a little about my late uncle, who spent 10 years in a persistent vegetative state, which I thought sort of represented, for me at least, one of these instances. We'd also talked a little about what surveys show that people fear most: a painful death. And I have here in quotes, a death marked by suffering, ? And the reason the question mark is there is because for some people there seems to be a sense that a degree of suffering is an appropriate part of a good dying. And I think this is especially true for some religious people who think that their own suffering in effect mirrors or recapitulates a divine suffering, participates in a divine suffering in some way, and so they see this as okay. So, for example, you'll find certain religious traditions saying, pain, yes, but some suffering is appropriate to the human situation. It's just a kind of a theological conviction they have. That's why there's a question mark behind suffering. And of course, suffering can be of all kinds. Social death, when one dies alone or abandoned. And this came from one of you, and it's always up there. It's just usually not in the top three. A death that burdens our survivors. Probably this is the number one on my personal list about things that I fear. We'd also talked about when biographical death precedes biological death. Your life, your sense of self, your sense of being a person in a community or a family is gone, but your body is still around. An undignified death, and people have very divergent notions about what this means. When dying diminishes our status or self-esteem. Dignity is a phrase that seems to be one that people latch onto as something that ought to belong to our self, but we fear may not always under certain circumstances. And so you find certain living will statutes in states, some states, are called the Death with Dignity Act. Others are called the Natural Death Act and so on. But dignity seems to be an important concept to attach to who we sense ourselves to be. So one of the questions it's useful to think about is, what comprises our dignity? What is it that makes us dignified to the extent that we are? And notice I, straighten up a little, because it's thought to be something that applies to our species but not others. An ugly death. What do we mean by this? Well, different people have different understandings, And I take it this is almost a purely aesthetic category, although it can relate to some of the others, such as pain or suffering. But for some people, an ugly death would be a death from exsanguination, bleeding out. For some, it would be a death marked by struggle, such as a death from choking, or an agonal death of any kind is usually thought about as ugly in this aesthetic sense. It partakes in this notion of undignified, right? Okay, we're just building a list here, and your fears may be different, and I hope we can talk about that a bit later. Is a quick death a good death? Here's a bit of doggerel, right? A long life and a merry one, a quick death, and an easy one, a cold beer, and another one. But this has not always been the case. Historically, the idea that one would die quickly and unprepared for death is thought to be a very bad thing. The Rogation Day prayer, this is from the Episcopal and Roman Catholic traditions. Deliver us, O Lord, from a sudden and unprepared for death. Now, why? Not a rhetorical question. Why would someone be worried about dying quickly and without preparation?
Maybe missing the last rites.
Missing the last rites, missing the goodbyes, missing the opportunity to be forgiven of your sins, right? Very directly in this case. And, yes, sir? Yeah, right. You didn't have your will in order, or whatever it is. Yeah, exactly. You'll remember from Shakespeare's play Hamlet, Hamlet's father has been killed. He was the king. He was killed by Hamlet's uncle, Claudius. Claudius becomes the king. And so Hamlet is intent on revenge. And he has an opportunity, but damn it all, the problem is King Claudius is at his prayers. Right? So Hamlet says, well, gosh, if I kill him now, he's just going to be forgiven of his sins and go straight up to heaven. I don't want that to happen. So he hesitates. Misses the opportunity. But this is the idea. The idea is that there is a preparation. So don't go too quickly, right? I don't know whether that conviction is still around with people or not. You can tell me. We talked a little about this quote from Rilke, a death of one's own. A kind of dying that evolves out of the life one has had, rather than just end it or be dramatically different from the life one has had, but it evolves out of that life, right? So that each death, in a sense, has its own appropriate ending. But I want to know, what is the positive content of this desire? What are the particulars of that? It's useful to think about, because if one wants anything like this, it's very useful to say, what are then the prime values, the base values that we want to realize or reflect in the dying? If you looked at the modern period, meaning roughly the last 30 to 40 years, you might think that what we, at least as Americans, really have in mind here is an autonomous death. And it's worth looking at this for just a moment. Autonomy, of course, two Greek roots, auto, self, nomos, law or governance. This was a phrase used to describe the kind of independence that the classical Greek city-states had, Athens and Sparta. And it's captured in all kinds of American documents, all kinds of, it's in the Declaration of Independence. Here's Abraham Lincoln. I just love this phrase, no man is wise enough to govern another without his consent. But it usually means roughly the prerogative to act in accord with your own values and to make your choices without being coerced or forced to do anything by anyone else. I mean, this is our middle name, right? In the United States. Freedom, liberty are other phrases for this, but it has a specific kind of sense of lack of coercion, freedom or independence. Here's John Stuart Mill. His classic essay on liberty. In the part which merely concerns himself, not other people, and over his own body and mind, the individual is sovereign. Anglo-American law has thought that this was an incredibly important principle. Nathanson v. Klein, 1960, is where this begins to show up in American jurisprudence with regard to medical affairs. Each man may expressly prohibit the performance of life-saving surgery or other medical treatment. So it doesn't matter if it's foolish or ill-advised or ill-informed. Your refusal of a treatment, even a life-saving treatment, is the final word. Now, that is not quite as easy to execute sometimes, right? But at least this is a part of the legal and also the ethical tradition of the last, 60 years. The way we embody this, both in law and in ethics, is with this notion of informed consent. It's worth talking just a minute about the legal notion of informed consent, which is that you have to be informed to the extent usually that the physician's colleagues inform his or her patients just what it is that is proposed, what the alternatives are, the good and bad parts of the treatment, and so on. Okay? So this is inscribed into law currently in such a way that we just assume this is going to happen. It's taken for granted, and that shows you how deeply ingrained it is, I think, in our traditions. Yes, sir?
Well, I mean, that sounds almost crazy, the first thing, but people think, that you're going to have surgery, you're going to be wonderful. You have life-saving surgery, and you're going to be,
That's right.
and you're going to be, if not a vegetable, severely disabled.
So the point being made here is that surgery doesn't always turn out to be as wonderful as sometimes we hope it will be, and is only partially successful or sometimes not successful at all. And that, in fact, is the whole crux of the matter. You get to decide and make your best judgment about that. So, following this train of thought, one might think that a good death is, at a minimum, a death that is marked by respect for the individual's autonomy. Advanced directives are all about this. Living wills are all about this. Durable powers of attorney, organ donation policies, all of that follows from this really fundamental principle. The aim is to ensure that our wishes are fulfilled when we are no longer able to express them, right? Carrying autonomy beyond decisional capacity. This creates a lot of problems, and we're going to talk about some of them. But just think about what this kind of concept entails. It says, if I now, as a competent individual, or at least let's hope so, make a choice about what I will or will not receive in the future when I am no longer able to speak for myself, and in that sense incompetent, decisionally incapable, I want you to do what I have said today. That's a tricky thing, and we'll talk a lot more about that. But I just want to root it in your mind as a way in which we prize and respect this notion of individual self-determination in medical decisions and in situations in which we are terminally ill. I said this was a difficult thing to pull off, and I want to talk just a little now about some of the precarious aspects of this death that is the way I said I wanted it, right? Well, there's the element of luck or fate. We just don't have control over certain aspects of life. You can be unlucky, or you can have the fates working against you, if you like that kind of language. But the problems are more extensive than that. We will likely have a diminished ability to exercise our will in life-threatening situations because the entire professional armamentarium of medicine and the health professions is set up to keep us going as a default position, not the only position. And this is not to gainsay all that's happened in terms of palliative care and hospice care. It's rather to say that the default position, where we fall back to most comfortably and easily, is we're going to save this life. That's written into hospital policies. It's written into the legal restraints. Don't ever expect an EMT service called to pick you up, to follow exactly what you want or what your family tells them that you want. They have their own agenda. By law, they're trained in a certain kind of way. They're in the life-saving business. Now, we've tried to do something about that in terms of so-called out-of-hospital do not resuscitate orders, or a post order. But, boy, that's a dicey proposition. So there are medical traditions, there are hospital policies, there are legal restraints. It may also be that your family actually isn't ready. A colleague of mine has developed an entire lecture called "The Family Isn't Ready." And it's about the fact that you're ready, you're clear, but your family isn't. More about that next week. Or your family thinks they know better. So is an advance directive signed 10 years ago the one that your family thinks now is the one that ought to apply? Not unless you've had a conversation last week with them. They may not. Because, geez, Dad's enjoying life now. He didn't think he would, but he is. Or so we think. Okay, and we have a limited capacity to predict what we will want in extremis. I think this is just a kind of a universal human phenomenon. We're not especially good predictors of what we will want in some future time. We are wrong frequently. And we have been wrong. Think about a time in which you thought you know what you wanted and it turned out to be something else. Almost anything you can think of will do here. You thought you wanted a 2-story house, but actually you didn't. You really wanted a 1-story, I mean, you thought you wanted a Lamborghini, but actually what you got was a Buick. And so on. The whole business about predicting is fraught with difficulty. And it's even more fraught if we're talking about what are our core values, our most important values. So the first thing one ever learns as a philosophy student is that people often are in ignorance of their core or basic values. This is the story of Socrates. Remember that little pugnacious Greek who was running around ancient Athens and buttonholing people and saying, "What's the meaning of..." He asked priests, "What's the meaning of true piety?" He asked generals, "What's the nature of courage?" And legislators, "What's the true nature of justice?" And he found they didn't know. But they thought they knew. And his mission, of course, was to bring people from a state of false certainty to a state of ignorance or agnosticism in which they could then begin to explore. But I take it that we do not have, as humans, a transparent window into our souls or into our deep psyche in which the values are all kind of laid out. 1, 2, 3, okay? That's the bet I'm making. And I think there's plenty of evidence to back that up. So what I'm saying is the precariousness in part relates to our human frailty in terms of understanding what it is that is really deeply most important to us. So more about this later. Here's a little amplification on the idea that hospitals shape the end of life. This is an absolutely wonderful book by a nurse anthropologist named Sharon Kaufman. Her 2006 book, A Time to Die. The core purpose of the hospital is to maintain life. It's a powerful agenda, and one most of the time that works extremely well for us, right? So back to this business about autonomy. We talked about the importance of it. We talked about some of the hedges on it, some of the limitations. But maybe what we're talking about here is just a precondition for something else. Maybe this is just the negative notion. What I want to be sure I'm free of is somebody else's controlling agenda. So this is why I fight so hard for it. I want to be free of the agenda of hospitals, rescuers of all kinds, including those found in my own family, the good intentions of people who are trying to help me stay around a little bit longer when I'm ready to go. But it remains open then the question, what are we free for? What are the values we want to actualize? And so I'm back to the most fundamental question of this whole series of talks and conversations. What's a good death for you? What's going to make it good? What are the things that really make it one that you can say yes to? Well, here's an answer from Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. You probably know of this. Probably one of the most widely read books on death and dying, dating from 1969. She said, you know, there are 5 stages, but she didn't mean them necessarily as a kind of a lockstep. You go through 1 and then 2 and then 3. She talked about them really as more movements, but I've identified them 1 through 5 just to demark them so we can talk about them a bit. Denial, of course, not me. This is the terminal diagnosis that one gets, and you say, nope, it's not me. Whereas a friend of mine said who had pancreatic cancer, and he learned there was a 3-year survival of 2%. This is a few years ago. He said, that's me. I'm in that 2%, right? I knew I'd show up in the stats, and there I am. It's not me. Of course, he was dead in 3 years. Another phase of dealing with this is anger. Why me? This is a justice motif. Why me? I've been such a good person. I've contributed, you know? I don't deserve this. This is not fair. Bargaining. Yes, me. Yes, right. Okay, I got that diagnosis. However, I've got an ace up my sleeve. I'm going to start living a different life. I'm going to eat right. I'm going to take all my medications and keep all my doctor's appointments. I'm going to be nicer to my children. I'm going to do a lot of things, right, that is really going to show, again, it's a part of the justice motif, right? It's going to show that I don't deserve this and I'll find a way out of it. Or it can be a bargaining. You usually choose the most powerful bargaining partner you can find, bargaining with God. I'll lead a faithful life. I'm always reminded about St. Augustine, who said, please God, make me continent, but not now, not yet, right? But here, you're laying it on the line. I'm going to do it. Depression when bargaining has failed, and then finally acceptance. Kubler-Ross believes that this is a kind of a acceptance of one's situation, and it's marked by calmness or a peace that one reaches after moving through all these maneuvers to try to get out of it. Again, it's important to remember she didn't say we move through these in sequence, and she didn't say that, in fact, you don't cycle a couple of times through this if you cycle through it. One of the most important lessons, I think, from Kubler-Ross's research is this idea that denial, which we always try to break down by telling and retelling, geez, I told them they had the diagnosis, that this is not a matter of truth or untruth, that it's a matter of being able to take in the truth and accept it. So the opposite of acknowledgement of a terminal diagnosis is panic. It would destroy you to take this in. So you need a buffer zone. You need a defense mechanism, right? Things we've all used all our lives, defense mechanisms to keep the truth at bay, to keep reality at bay just long enough until we can muster our resources to take it in. So this is a well-practiced thing. It's not surprising that we would use this near the end of life. One of the most important but really neglected studies is one by Barney Glasser and Anselm Strauss called Awareness of Dying, and he said this whole business of denial is tricky because it's proportional in the patient to the family's needs and the doctor's needs. So people who know they have a terminal diagnosis are very likely then to say, no, everything's fine, if they think the physician and especially the family need to hear that. So Glasser and Strauss call this mutual pretense. We all know, but we're both pretending for the benefit of each other that we don't know, right? Kubler-Ross says denial of death persists in many forms. She thinks it's always present, even after we have mastered it on many levels. And here's the most important thing, I think, is that psychologically we are much more complicated than we are logically. Psychologically, we are much more complicated than we are logically, so that one can hold an attitude of denial or hope or whatever it is at the same time that you have a rational conviction that, yes, you're actually terminally ill. The psyche is a tricky thing and operates on many levels. I think that's the message here. Kubler-Ross also says that some kind of hope persists in all stages and all of the kind of maneuvers that we make to cope with our terminal illness. And I love the phrase of Jonathan Lear, Radical Hope. He has a book by this name. It's a conviction that even with the greatest loss, a good that you can't even name is still a possibility. So it's not a hoping for something, it's just a demeanor of hope that something good may yet emerge. Lear's book is actually about a Crow, a Native American Crow chief named Plenty-Coup. And Plenty-Coup saw the Crow culture destroyed in the late 19th and early 20th century, and he embodied for the Crow culture a kind of hope that out of this something still might emerge, and acted on that. It's a really wonderful story. If you want to read a great book, this is a good one. Radical Hope by Jonathan Lear. The Persistence of Hope, Emily Dickinson, one of my candidates for the most important American poets. The thing with feathers that perches in the soul and sings the tune without the words and never stops at all. So I think probably a good death has some dimensionality of hope in it. I'm not quite sure how to identify that, and perhaps you can help me with it. And it's not necessarily a hope for an item, an outcome, an event, although it could be. But human beings can have a demeanor of hope that doesn't attach to any object. I think one of our distinctive capacities. Okay, what's a good death? Here's some practical candidates. Dying in a way that reflects, completes, or improves upon one's sense of self. Improves on? Really? Do you really mean that, Churchill? Is it possible? Do you have some residual hope that the dying process is going to reveal something you didn't know or couldn't imagine in the mundane life that we usually lead? Some secret, some insight. Reflects, completes, or improves on. Ooh. All right. A death that does not burden survivors emotionally or financially. As I said, this is at the top of my list, probably of many of you also. Dying marked by caring, expressions of gratitude, love, reconciliation, hope, goodbyes. Yeah, maybe? Sound good? That would be a good death. Dying that includes an experience of the sacred. And as I said last week, the whole business about sacrality, what's holy, what's sacred, which is a kind of innate human capacity to experience that in a vast range of ways, means that death is pretty fertile ground for this. Okay. My favorite period in philosophy is late Roman Stoicism. So you're going to see, Marcus Aurelius cropping up now and then, a little Epicurus, a little Cicero, because I think there was a kind of wisdom in Stoicism that is not a part of contemporary philosophy often enough. So this is from the Emperor's Notebook. Remember, these are the things he was writing when he was waging war against German tribes. He's an emperor of Rome, and so he's out on the battlefield. This is where he died, actually. This is one of the things he wrote in the journal. Spend this brief moment walking through nature and greet your short journey's end with a good grace. This is my underlining. Like the olive that falls to the ground when it is ripe, blessing the earth that receives it and gratitude to the tree that bore it. So this is a good death, marked by grace, blessing, gratitude. Just one version. Remember Sarah Palin, who was John McCain's running mate? And she said that, if we have all of these changes in healthcare, and if physicians are actually compensated for talking to their patients about what their preferences might be for end of life, talking about the living will, the durable power of attorney, and so on, she said this will create death panels. Now, you may remember that she won for this the Pants on Fire Award given by NPR. But, it's just a marvelous thing. So I developed a little lecture I gave once called In Praise of Death Panels. But these are the things that would be in the death panel that I think would work really well for us. Doctors who will tell us when our treatment options are futile. They'll be honest with us. They'll also be skilled in palliative care. They'll get us into the right care at the right time. Families and friends that keep the vigil with us, embrace our deaths. Clergy that espouse and affirm the spiritual significance of our death. You can add to this, but the idea is that, maybe a death panel is a pretty good thing, Might work well depending on what they do. What is your particular notion of a good death? This is the question I actually want you to think about. And if you're so inclined, write it down. What's a good death? What's in that? What's the positive content of your notion of a good death? Now I'm going to do something a little hazardous, subject to lots of generalizations. But to get us talking about this, we've talked about the final process in life, the dying. When we say a good death, we mean what is the dying process like in terms of the elements that it has and the effects that it has. But there's also the question about what becomes of us. What's next? So I want to run through quickly 5 possible answers to this question of what's next. The reason for doing this is that it may be that your notion of what's next has an influence on what you think about good dying. Could be nothing, could be resurrection, could be continuation, could be recycling, and finally, I always have a category for agnosticism in everything that I do, being a real believer in ignorance, my own especially. So here's the nothing resolution. And you can just read this. This is Epicurus, again, a much misunderstood philosopher. He wasn't for pleasure. His notion of pleasure was leading a really reasonable and moderate life. Epicureanism was not, fancy wining and dining. It was actually moderation and understanding of what's pleasurable to us and what's harmful. So, you're here, you're gone. When you're gone, how could it mean something to you? You're not here anymore, right? You're dead. There's nothing. That's one kind of answer. We pass into nothingness at least as self-conscious beings, I'm saying, trying to gloss a little on Epicurus. And maybe I'll continue in terms of my genetics, but this may not be actually the continuation that excites me, right? Because what does that mean? Resurrection. All right, this is the official doctrine of Christianity. As far as I know, it's the only one in which resurrection is really the big thing, right? St. Paul talked an awful lot about this in his letters. He talks about the spiritual body. The pneumatikos is the Greek phrase. Here's the male and female versions. Now, the spiritual body, according to this doctrine, is perfect, right? In every regard. Now, in this version, of course, the guy looks like he's been at Gold's Gym for quite a long time. And I'm not sure that's the idea of perfection you have, but the idea is that you're complete and perfect in this spiritual body. And it emanates a kind of light. I chose these pictures because they seem to kind of indicate that. And it's enduring, it's everlasting. It's got a lot of good things going for it. This is the idea that there will be an embodiment, but it's not quite like our biological embodiment. It's better, flawless. A reward for right belief and fidelity. Frequently, the current life is thought about as a qualifying exam for this kind of resurrected life. Existence in heaven is another way it's talked about, beyond evil and suffering. Incarnation of the true self. The resurrected body encapsulates this kind of the real true self, the final self, the self in all its glory, not the kind of flawed self we have now, right? This is the idea, in the presence of God. Okay, that's number 2. Continuation. You might believe, many people have, that the soul is a separate and eternal entity. And boy, how do you get this in a picture, right? This is the best I could find. But it's this idea that there's something eternal within each of us that survives, that is not subject to death. This is a part of very ancient thought, and Plato was very explicit about this. It also is a Christian heresy. Gnosticism is the name it's typically given, which understands people as divine souls trapped in a materialistic world. So the body is a shell, it's an impediment, and in its worst situation, it's an evil. It just kind of pulls you down, keeps dragging you down. You get this notion of a weighty, undesirable kind of entity that's keeping the soul from realizing itself. And what happens at death is that the soul is released. Number 4, recycling. Perpetual destruction and recreation. A lot of Eastern traditions, most of the forms of Hinduism that I'm acquainted with have this as the basic belief system. Samsara. And I really like this picture because you see the old guy falling into one loop of the infinity, right? And coming out as a newborn person. Although you have to be careful here because you might be reborn as a hippopotamus or a horse or a lower form, and it all depends on, how good you've been in this life. Okay, I'm doing this very cavalierly and I'm doing it with great generalization. So I mean, please believe me, I don't want to offend anyone. I'm just trying to lay out these alternatives because they're interesting to think about. And I'll be corrected by any of you that know better. Actions in this life determine future incarnations, karma. This is the iron law of cause and effect. Whatever you do in this life, you will reap the benefits or the deficits of that in the next. And the ultimate goal is merging with the universal spirit, moksha, when you don't have to do another incarnation, right? You've reached the end. Buddhism is a gloss on this, of course, in terms of how you break out of this cycle. Can you read this in the back? In a past life, you were a bowl of flour, butter, eggs, sugar, ginger, and molasses. I don't know. I think I found this online, so I'm not sure the source. Yeah, the New Yorker is a great source of. But it's just not this simple, of course. I'm laying out some alternatives, but we're all kind of hybrids, or most of us are. It's hard to find a pure type. Here's an example. Episcopalians who meditate, they attend Dharma talks, and whose favorite religious text is the Bhagavad Gita, a sacred text of Hinduism. That may be true for many of you. It is for many people I know. we're not just kind of pure types. We don't follow church doctrine or religious teaching all the way down the line. We kind of pick and choose. Geez, this sounds good. I think I'll put a little of that, you know. So this means lots of hybrid answers to the question of what's next. And if you remember what I was saying last week, this is exactly what we should expect. Because if we are polymorphous in relation to experiences of the holy or sacred, then practically anything can be a conduit for a religious experience, a sacred experience, an experience of the holy or the spiritual. Eating, walking, sex, talking with friends, meditating, praying, exercising. You know, it doesn't have to necessarily be anything special. I talked about holding my grandson for the first time, but it doesn't necessarily need to be like that. The fifth alternative, agnosticism, it's a quote from Heraclitus. I think he's the most ancient of the people I'm going to quote. We just have fragments, but this is one of his. What follows death is nothing imagined or hoped for. Now, how did he know, right? Nothing imagined or hoped for. So it's not nothing, but it's not anything like what you might think it is. The reason this is kind of appealing to me is that, you know, how much of our functioning brain do we have any self-conscious awareness of? It's a very small percent. 10%? Would that get it? Those of you who know? That means all kinds of things are going on, right? That we're just not aware of. And I'm also impressed by the fact that we're just kind of spinning around on this little planet on the edge of the universe. Which means our ignorance is much vaster than we imagine. As I say, there's knowing what you know, knowing what you don't know, but then not knowing what you don't know, right? It's that not knowing what you don't know that's being appealed to, I think, here. Nothing imagined or hoped for. Another way to put this, it's impossible to have a well-grounded, or you might say well-reasoned or well-thought-out answer to the question, what's next? Now, you might be okay with this. So it's not worrisome. It's no more worrisome than where I was before I was born, which probably doesn't worry us at all, right? So the question of where we're going next, if anywhere, is an impossible kind of question to be asking. So the agnosticism is, we're comfortable with that. That's all right. I'm at peace with that, okay? Or you could be a little concerned about this because you might believe that it is certain beliefs or practices which are important to what happens next. And almost every version of an afterlife hooks these up. So you better have the right beliefs and practices. Because if you don't, you're going to miss out. This is Pascal's wager, right? Remember Blaise Pascal, the French guy who said, well, I could not believe or I could believe. If I don't believe and there's an afterlife, what a huge penalty. So, you know, I better bet this way. Oh. Okay. So I've been leading you along the garden path, and now I'm going to throw a monkey wrench in the whole thing. Is the idea of life after death based on a kind of human hubris, a kind of egocentrism? Now, believe it or not, it would matter if you thought this was true, because you might think about death a little differently. So here's a biologist, Mary Beth Sappho. We see ourselves as the end point of evolution, not just the center of the universe, but as the only love object of its creator. I don't remember exactly when, I think in my 40s, I began to really take seriously the notion that the human species was not the end point of evolution. There's going to be something, I hope, there's something a little better, a little smarter, a little less destructive coming after us. And if that's true, what does that do to our understanding about life and death and who we are in the great furniture of the universe? So here's just a blatant, statement by David Hume, the greatest of the Scottish Enlightenment philosophers. The life of man is of no greater importance to the universe than that of an oyster. And I love this quote from the French theologian Paul Ricoeur, who takes this up and then works on it theologically. He says, true religion involves renunciation, getting beyond all expectation of reward or punishment or personal survival. You may have thought about this. I certainly have. What's going to happen after I'm dead? Well, people will adjust. Things will go on. Vanderbilt will still be teaching ethics. My family will do fine, I think, and hope. Stock market won't take a dip. Patriots will probably still win the Super Bowl. Yeah. So here's another little drop in, okay? Remember, we're playing jazz here. We're just hitting notes, and developing. Let me read this to you from Leaves of Grass. This is my candidate for the greatest poet in the American tradition. What do you think has become of the young and old men? What do you think has become of the women and children? They are alive and well somewhere. The smallest sprouts show there is really no death. And if ever there was, it led toward life. Death leading toward life. And does not wait at the end to arrest it. And ceased the moment life appeared. And goes onward and outward, and nothing collapses. And to die is different from what anyone supposed, and luckier. Little like Heraclitus, only different, luckier. Let that sit in your brain for a while, and we'll come back to it in future sessions. So, remember my reason for this little run-through about the afterlife had to do with what is the impact that one's convictions or lack of convictions about an afterlife or what happens next have on the notion of what would count for you as a good death. Is your notion of dying well grounded in a certain view of what happens after death? Or, an alternative, is the best, ethically best, attitude one that separates these? There's living and there's dying and the dying process, and then there's whatever happens after, right? You could keep these separate. And you say, well, I don't know, and it doesn't matter, I have beliefs about it, but, that'll take care of itself. Or, is it best, meaning here ethically best, to have no view at all? To be absent any conviction about this? Can you see that there might be a benefit in that? To have no convictions whatever. Maybe because it would allow you to focus on the present with a complete kind of presence. I'm just throwing these out, hoping you'll have some sense of these. Uh-oh. That's near-death experiences, and I don't want to talk about that just yet. First, I want to see what kind of comments and questions you have to what I've said, and especially if there are things that I'm talking about that you don't get, You were just making nonsense in part of this. Yes, sir.
Two things, one comment and one question. It may have been implied on some of your slides, but I think one part of a good death is seeing your health providers and the family being viewed with compassion and empathy.
Yes.
And then the question, and that gets into the near death, which you may want to put off.
Can you hear on this side? Could you stand? Would you mind?
I think part of a good death is being surrounded by healthcare providers and family and loved ones that are imbued with empathy and compassion. And the question I had, you may want to put this off till later because it has to do with near death. I just wondered if the light at the end of the tunnel and all that, is that in all faith traditions? Do they describe similar things?
That's a great question, and I don't know. Does anybody know? Do you know? Does Confucianism ever report any of that? Any from any Asian cultures, or it may be that this is fairly recent enough that we were able to bring people back from near death in terms of our technological capacity. That's a fairly new phenomenon. But there's a ton written about it. Whether it's a universal human experience is a very good question. Maybe I'll try to find out, Yes, ma'am.
I've read a lot of the books about the near-death experience, but it's been a long time ago. But my recollection is, I don't know if it's Raymond Moody or one of the other writers that's written about this, that there have been, going back to the Egyptian Book of the Dead and other ancient sources,
Mm-hmm. Can you hear over there?
some similar types of experiences that people have recorded.
So maybe the Egyptian Book of the Dead has something like that in it. Maybe this is not a modern experience, and maybe it's a more of a universal experience. I just don't know.
Yeah, I mentioned Life After Life last week.
Yes, you did.
I just finished it, so my memory's better. He does, in fact, go way back after he finishes portraying the, contemporary patients who had survived an NDE and he had interviewed. He goes through all that, but then he steps back and says, by the way, these things that people are saying today are not new. They are
Mm-hmm.
the same things you said in ancient times.
Thank you. Anybody have an afterlife kind of notion that I didn't talk about? That would be interesting. Yes, sir.
So I was just going to ask if is there anything but anecdotal evidence that our denial, at least initially, is reinforced by anecdotes of misdiagnosis, and what's the other thing? The fact that somebody said, "Oh, you've got 3 months to live," and that was 1959, and you're still living, that kind of.
Okay, is there any evidence to suggest that denial is a function of things like a misdiagnosis,
Or at least reinforced.
reinforced by? I don't know. I don't know what kind of evidence there is to suggest that that would be the case. It would be a natural way to reinforce this, and that's what people in denial frequently say first. Some misdiagnosis. You got somebody else's lab report here that you're working with. But as I say, if denial is in fact a defense mechanism that's really skillfully practiced all through life, gosh, I didn't make a C on that exam, did I? Et cetera, all through. I mean, this is, right? Yes, sir.
But on denial, your slide earlier talked about essentially denial by the patient being proportional to
Can you hear on that side? Good.
let's say the world and accept it.
Denial is a hell of a problem. I agree with that.
Nobody around the patient has. They're still all in denial. Because then the patient has to decide, should I I don't want to have conflict with my family. Should I fake it and try to convince them that I too am still in denial even though I'm not? I mean, it's a big mess if people progress at different.
It is a big mess, yes. And it led to many ethics consults, I can tell you. But you can understand, in a sense, the family is also having a loss. They don't want that loss. And in the sense of how can you comfortably interact is really a tough question. We're just going to kind of go along until we can't any longer. It is, it's kind of muddling through this without having the hard conversation. That's what I wanted to say. Yes, sir.
I am a Baptist minister. I come from the order of Dr. W.A. Criswell, the minister of Doris Hobby was on that order. And all of my life I heard him say that you were going to die in the pulpit or either in the woods. And he didn't worry about if he was white or church. And told another minister, when the Lord got ready for him, he would let him know. And he did. And he said he saw an indescribably beautiful face, and he couldn't rest in it anymore. And one of the other things is, I don't mix my music in church. Nothing is contemporary, all that stuff. I don't mix it. I keep mine pure. But he also said that unity. He said, if you honor the Lord's Father, then you have your strength and health.
Mm-hmm.
When the time comes when you don't have that, you will remember.
Thank you. So this raises a very interesting question. How many of us believe that there's going to be a little hint, right? A little premonition, a little signal, yeah? I mean, surely we deserve that much, Really? We're back to this, yes, that this is it. Remember Sanford and Son? This is the big one, right? This is the big one, right? But the idea that you ought to have, or, it would be really nice, fitting and appropriate if you had a little, because this is the thing that would get you better prepared, right? You might say some last things that would be important. Yes, ma'am?
Years ago, when I was a kid, my dad used to say, I wish I knew where I was going to die. And we said, why? He said, I wouldn't go there.
There you go. Wonderful. Yeah, stay away. Yes, sir.
I would talk about a good death and what that means, because I had an aunt that I thought had a fantastic death.
Fantastic death.
Well,
Yeah, okay.
I said that, a fantastic death, because her husband died of cancer, and he spent 6 months in this horrible treatment, miserable all the damn time. I mean,
Yeah? That was-
cancer treatment can be pretty damn bad.
Yes, it's pretty torturous. So,
So she had started smoking heavily at 15 and smoked all the way to age 50 and drank too much too. She realized she was, and changed it, stopped smoking, cut back on her drinking, and started swimming a half hour every day. And she was in a hell of a good shape. But of course, having started smoking for, 25, 35 years, she got lung cancer. And the type she had, I know, we had a seminar at Vanderbilt. You had like a 1 or 2% chance of surviving in the best cases. Well, she was in her 70s. And so she actually went down to, I can't think of the one.
well, is the fantastic part that she outlived her...
No, the fantastic part is she went down, is dragged down by a friend, and looked at treatment, and she said, to hell with it. And because she knew the figures.
Well,
She knew the figures.
so the fantastic part is the fantastic part that she avoided the long...
went back
torturous
and said, "To hell with
chemotherapy.
it,"
Yeah.
and she went back, went there swimming, had all kinds of friends then. It was almost a year, lived a normal life, went out with friends to a nice dinner and a couple of glasses of wine, came back the next day and had my two cousins were down there with her, came back the next day, felt sick and died that night.
Pretty
And
good.
I said, God loved her because that's the damn way I want to go.
Oh, no, that's interesting. So, see, I didn't know you were going to add that little part on, right?
Presbyterian food.
Yes.
Telling you all that.
Okay. Well, okay, but this is a very important motif, that if the deity does favor you, you know, you're going to get a death that is maybe not fantastic, but it's going to be, you know, a lot better than it might be. Yeah. See, this is one of the ways our psyche works. It's just fascinating. Yes, sir, you had a question.
I was trying to substitute the word living in all of those slides to, dying, from dying to living. Is there a fear of living as opposed to a fear of dying?
Is there a fear of living as opposed to a fear of...
Meaning that, you know, if you live too long, you know, if you run out of money, if you run out of health.
I'm so glad you brought this up. How many of you have a notion that it's possible to live too long? It's possible to live too long, yes. And so the fear would have to do... Thank you for that. Because this means that the fear is that you didn't die at the right time. The right time. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Yes. All these things begin to figure in. Thank you for that comment.
Larry, one comment.
Yes. Yes, Joe.
I reflected a lot about both my parents as you were talking here.
Stand up, please.
I was reflecting about my two parents who were talking today. They died in their late 60s, very different. My father had a 3-year journey with cancer, so he was very aware, and my mother unexpectedly. But over the years, I've believed, and I'll label it a little bit, I believe they both died good deaths. Okay. My mother was very practical. My father was a bit of a philosopher. So,
I'm sorry.
I say that in a complimentary way. But just listening to you, my mother had her house in order. Okay, and your good death. So her house was in order, and I worked with her to get her will straightened out, et cetera, et cetera. And she died very suddenly of a brain aneurysm. So her house was in order. And my father kept journals as he was dying, which we've not published over 25 years. So that tells you something about grief. But he worked very hard to get his house in order interiorly, not exteriorly. And as I've thought about them over the years, they died by going beyond themselves. So it was sort of, I would say, like in Jungian terms, they were fully individuated, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
You know, and I don't want to make it esoteric, but they essentially died hard deaths, you know, not easy, but it was beyond self. It was no longer a self-orientation. It was something else that was a feature of that. Among two very remarkably different people, you know, in terms of temperament or personality, things of that nature.
Thank
I
you.
don't know if that makes sense.
It does make sense, and it's I think, an excellent example of what I was talking about when I said this newness, this kind of expansion, or this kind of achievement, which your dying process allows you to accomplish. That wasn't part of your life before. And, you know, it's just a great curiosity to me how many people hold that as a part of their image of a good death. Now, we're almost out of time. One last question. Yes, sir?
Yeah, a comment about what's a good death and always the conflict. My mother's philosophy on death was it's all about how it impacts other people. Because for me, there'll be no impact. I'll be dead. And she believed that,
Thank you. Yes. Okay, I want to leave one slide to close with. Can you read this? So the man's in the hospital bed and he says, there was a tunnel and a bright light. My grandparents, Uncle Lenny, my dog Shep, my tonsils, appendix, and all of my missing socks were there to greet me. All right. I'll see you next week.